The hush of the Grand Athenaeum Library was a language Alastair Finch had spent a lifetime mastering. It was not a silence of emptiness, but one of profound reverence, a weighted quiet where the rustle of a turning page sounded like a whisper from the past. To Alastair, the library was not a building of brick and mortar. It was a living organism, a vast, interconnected mind, and he was its sole, dedicated caretaker. His domain was the Special Collections Wing, a climate-controlled sanctum where the air tasted of vanilla and decaying paper, and where the light, filtered through UV protective glass, fell in soft, reverent shafts onto ancient leather bindings. His days were a ritual of order. He would arrive before dawn, the pale gray light barely illuminating the city streets, to perform his rounds. He checked the hygrometers, ensuring the humidity was a perfect 45%. He cleaned the shelves not with a common duster, but with a soft horsehair brush, each stroke a caress. He knew the position of every book, not just by its Dewey Decimal number, but by its soul. He knew which books sighed when their covers were opened, and which ones held the faint, ghostly scent of a long-dead reader's pipe tobacco. But this sacred trust was constantly under siege. The desecration came not from vandals or thieves, but from a far more insidious source: the borrowers. The people who took these volumes out into the chaotic, uncaring world, never to return them. To Alastair, an overdue book was not a minor inconvenience. It was a kidnapping. A prisoner of war, held captive in a dusty bedside table, used as a coaster, or forgotten in the damp recesses of a basement. Each day he would print the list, the long-overdue list. It was a roll call of the lost, a litany of disrespect. He would sit at his mahogany desk in the office, hidden behind the botanical texts of the 19th century shelf, a pot of oolong tea steaming beside him. He would run a finger down the names, his face a mask of placid concentration. But behind his spectacles, his gray eyes held a cold, precise fury. These were not just names, they were sinners. They were individuals who had broken the most fundamental covenant of knowledge, to share it, to return it so others may learn. His sense of justice was not born of rage, but of a profound, twisted need for balance. The universe of the Athenaeum was skewed, and he was the only one who could right it. His methods, like his mind, were meticulous. He was not a brute. Violence was a clumsy, loud tool, the antithesis of the elegant order he sought to restore. His justice would be quiet, subtle, as natural as the turning of a season. From a locked drawer in his desk, he retrieved a slim black file. Inside were not dossiers of his targets, but their stories. He had researched them all. He knew their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. He selected the first file for the week. The name was Clara Evans. The book, Fiori di Firenze, a rare volume of Renaissance botanical illustrations. Due date 487 days ago. Alastair opened the file. A photograph of a young woman with a bright, careless smile. A printout of her social media profile, showing pictures of her at trendy cafes, on hiking trips, a life lived in the open air, a stark contrast to the imprisoned book. He had seen the book himself through her apartment window during one of his quiet observational evenings. It was on her coffee table, its beautiful vellum pages marred by a dark ring of condensation from a glass, a coaster. The sacrilege was absolute. "It is time for you to be returned to circulation, Miss Evans," he whispered, the words barely disturbing the air. Or rather, for the book to be, "You, I'm afraid, are a permanent stain on its record." He closed the file and placed it neatly in his briefcase. His work for the day was done. Now the preparation would begin, not in the library, but in his private greenhouse, a place where rare and beautiful things grew, some for their beauty, and some for a much more purposeful final harvest. The scales would be balanced, one way or another. Alastair's greenhouse was the library's wild, secret twin. Where the Athenaeum was a place of preserved death, the greenhouse was a chamber of concentrated, potent life. It was nestled behind his unassuming bungalow, a glass structure shimmering with condensation, hidden from the world by a high brick wall and a trellis of climbing jasmine. The air inside was thick, humid, and redolent with a complex perfume of damp earth, sweet blossoms, and something else, something sharp and dangerous. He moved through the aisles of his botanical collection with the same unhurried grace he displayed in the library. Here he was not just a caretaker. He was a creator, a master of a very different kind of knowledge. His fingers, so accustomed to the delicate grain of leather and paper, gently traced the spine of a leaf, noting the subtle venation. He pruned a wilting bloom from an orchid with a pair of silver snipers, the gesture as precise as a surgeon's. Most of the plants were for beauty or for his own private study of botany, a passion that rivaled his love for books. But in the very back, behind a screen of tall, feathery ferns, was his workshop. Here the plants were not just beautiful, they were functional. Deadly. His chosen instrument for Miss Evans was a rare species of delphinium, which he had cultivated himself from a seed acquired from a disgraced Russian botanist. He had named it Alistair's Blue, a private joke. Its flowers were a deceptively lovely shade of deep indigo, but its seeds and young leaves contained a potent cocktail of alkaloids. The poison, delphinine, was a terrifyingly efficient agent. It caused severe gastrointestinal distress, followed by cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory paralysis. To a medical examiner, it would look like a sudden, unexplained heart failure, especially in a young, seemingly healthy person. The key was dosage and delivery. He donned a pair of thin leather gloves and harvested a dozen of the plant's tenderest seed pods. He placed them in a small woven basket and took them to a central workbench. On it sat a beautiful brass alembic, an object that looked more like a piece of alchemical art than a piece of lab equipment. The process of distillation was a ritual. He ground the seeds with a mortar and pestle, releasing a faint, bitter scent. He added the powder to distilled water within the alembic's base, and with a steady blue flame from a Bunsen burner, began the slow, careful process of separation. As the liquid began to bubble and steam, he watched the glass coil of the condenser with intense focus. Minutes stretched into an hour. The first drops to emerge from the spout were discarded. Then, slowly, a clear, odorless liquid began to collect in a glass vial. This was the essence, the correction. It was colorless, tasteless, and, in the right quantity, absolutely final. He filled a small amber glass bottle with a dropper, stoppered it with a cork, and labeled it with a single, elegant symbol, a closed book. Now for the delivery. A direct approach was out of the question. He was a ghost, a whisper. His justice had to appear as an act of fate, a random tragedy. He knew from his surveillance that Clara Evans was a creature of habit and a lover of artisanal trends. She frequented a small coffee shop called The Daily Grind, and her social media was filled with pictures of their lattes and pastries. His plan took shape with the same chilling simplicity as the rest of his work. He would not give her the poison. He would let her take it from him. He spent the evening blending a high-quality Earl Grey tea, adding dried lavender and cornflowers for aesthetic appeal. To this he added 3 precise drops of the distilled delphinium. It was enough. He then packaged the loose-leaf blend in a small hand-stamped muslin bag with a label that read, "The Athenaeum Blend, a quiet moment for contemplation." The irony was a private pleasure. The final touch was the signature. From the library's own rooftop garden, he plucked a single perfect sprig of helichrysum, also known as the everlasting flower. He took it to his office and placed it between the pages of a heavy, pressing book, just as he would a rare botanical specimen. He would leave the pressed flower on her body, a final, silent bookmark in the story of her life. A testament to the fact that some things, like knowledge and justice, are meant to last forever. He packed the tea and the flower into a plain brown paper bag. The next morning, he would simply leave it on a table at the Daily Grind, a seemingly forgotten gift waiting for its intended recipient. The gears of order were turning. The balance was about to be restored. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of autumn. Alistair, dressed in his usual tweed jacket and gray trousers, looked like any other academic on his way to work. But his destination was not the hallowed halls of the Athenaeum, not yet. First, a small errand. He carried the plain brown paper bag as if it contained nothing more than his lunch. The Daily Grind was an assault on the senses. The hiss of the espresso machine was a vulgar shriek, the indie rock music a formless cacophony, and the overlapping conversations a chaotic jumble of meaningless noise. To Alistair, it was the sonic equivalent of a cluttered room. He approached the counter, his expression one of mild distaste. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed out of place amidst the chatter. While the barista prepared his order, he scanned the room. He knew Clara's routine. She always arrived between 8:15 and 8:30, sat at the small table by the window, and read the news on her tablet while sipping a vanilla latte. The table was currently empty. Perfect. He paid for his coffee, the exchange of money feeling grimy and transactional. He walked toward the window table, his movements unhurried. He sat down, placed his coffee on the table, and casually set the brown paper bag on the chair beside him as if he were just settling in. He took a single, slow sip of his coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. Then, as if remembering an important appointment, he checked his watch, stood with a soft sigh, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving the coffee half drunk and the paper bag forgotten on the chair. A ghost in the machine. From across the street, standing in the shadow of a grand old oak, he waited. He didn't have to wait long. At 8:22, Clara Evans arrived, her bright red scarf a splash of defiant color against the gray morning. She was laughing at something on her phone, her entire being radiating a carefree energy that Alistair found fundamentally wasteful. She ordered her latte and, seeing her usual table was taken, scanned for an alternative. Her eyes landed on the empty chair with the abandoned bag. Curiosity piqued, she approached. Alistair watched as she peered into the bag, her expression shifting from curiosity to delight. She pulled out the muslin sachet of tea, reading the label with a smile. "The Athenaeum blend," she murmured to herself, charmed by the serendipity. She looked around for the owner, saw no one, and shrugged, tucking her prize into her purse. She took the abandoned coffee cup, disposed of it, and settled in with her latte, none the wiser. The trap was sprung. Alistair turned and walked away, his step a little lighter. The rest of the day was a blur of routine. He processed new acquisitions. He assisted a doctoral student with a query regarding medieval cartography. He dusted the shelves in the rare poisons and antidotes section, a favorite of his. All the while, a quiet current of anticipation flowed beneath the placid surface of his day. He knew the poison would take several hours to fully manifest. It was designed to be insidious. That evening, he did not go to the greenhouse. He went home, made a simple dinner of toast and soup, and sat in his armchair with a book on the history of maritime law. Around 9 o'clock, he opened his laptop and navigated to Clara Evans's social media profile. Her last post from that morning was a picture of the tea sachet on the table at the Daily Grind with the caption, "A mysterious gift to start the day. Serendipity blessed." He refreshed the page periodically. By 10, there was a new comment. "Clara, are you okay? I've been calling." By 11, another. "OMG, has anyone heard from Clara?" By midnight, the first post appeared from a friend. "I don't know how to say this. I just got the call. Clara is gone. They think it was a massive heart attack. I'm in shock." Alistair closed his laptop. He felt no remorse, no triumph. He felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a librarian who has finally located a long-lost volume and placed it back on its proper shelf. The system was balanced. He had restored order. But one final task remained. He waited until 2 in the morning, when the city was deep in slumber. Dressed in black, a figure of utter anonymity, he drove to Clara's apartment building. He had, of course, scouted it exhaustively. He knew the landlord was careless, and that the fire escape on the rear of the building was never locked. He moved with a silent, practiced ease, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold metal. He slipped into her apartment through the unlocked kitchen window. The room was still. The half-empty mug of Athenaeum blend sat on her coffee table, next to the book. Fiori di Firenze. He walked over to it. The water ring was still there, a permanent scar on the vellum. He gently closed the cover. In the center of the living room floor, the police had outlined where her body had been found. The space was empty now, but he could picture her there. From his inner jacket pocket, he took the small pressed helichrysum flower. It was perfectly flat, its golden petals preserved in an eternal bloom. He knelt down and placed it gently in the center of the chalk outline. A bookmark, a final silent statement. He stood for a moment, admiring his work. Then, as silently as he had entered, he was gone. The librarian had completed his due diligence. The city, for a brief moment, held its breath in mourning for a life it barely knew. Clara Evans's death was a tragedy, a sad story about a young woman struck down by a sudden, undetectable cardiac anomaly. The obituary was kind, highlighting her vibrant spirit and love for life. The case file, thin and final, was stamped natural causes and filed away in a steel cabinet. But in the cluttered basement office of the 12th precinct, the file remained open on Detective Isabella Rossi's desk. Rossi was a woman built of sharp angles and sharper instincts. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, the color of strong coffee, missed little. She had a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw chaos, for finding the human element buried under mountains of data. "There's nothing there, Rossi," her partner Detective Miller had said that morning, dropping a styrofoam cup of coffee on her desk. "Toxicology came back clean, no signs of foul play. It's a sad but closed case." "I know," Rossi murmured, not looking at him. She was staring at a photograph in the evidence file, a close-up of the living room floor. In the center of the chalk outline was a small, golden object. "What about this?" Miller leaned over, squinting. "The flower? Forensics said it was a helichrysum, pressed, probably from a bookmark or a card she had, belonged to the victim." "Who carries a single pressed flower in their pocket?" Rossi asked, her voice low, "and leaves it on the floor when they're dying of a heart attack?" "People do weird things, Izzy. She was probably holding it. It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. To Rossi, it was a loose thread, an anomaly, a single, out-of-place note in a song that was otherwise perfectly, tragically mundane. She bagged the thought and filed it away, next to the feeling she always got when a case was too neat, too clean. While Rossi was wrestling with a ghost, Alastair Finch was basking in the glow of restored order. The Athenaeum felt lighter. The air in the Special Collections wing seemed clearer. He had performed his duty, and the library, in its own silent way, was grateful. He spent the next week in a state of placid productivity, recataloging a newly acquired collection of 18th-century naval logs. But the work was never truly done. The long-overdue list was a hydra, cut off one head, and two more appeared in its place. The following Monday, a new name caught his eye: Dr. Alastair Thorne, a tenured professor of ethics at the City University. The book Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a foundational text, due date 3,652 days ago, 10 years. The disrespect was staggering. A professor of ethics, a man who built his career on the principles of duty and moral law, had willfully violated the most basic intellectual duty of all. Alastair's research revealed Thorne to be a man of profound hypocrisy. He gave lectures on societal obligation while hoarding a cornerstone of Western philosophy in his private study, likely gathering dust behind a leather chair. For this sinner, a different correction was required. Thorne was older, his health more fragile. A poison that mimicked a stroke would be most convincing. For this, Alastair turned to another of his prized specimens, the oleander. Beautiful, common, and utterly lethal. Every part of the plant, from its pink blossoms to its woody stem, contained oleandrin and other cardiac glycosides. A concentrated extract would cause irregular heart rhythm, tremors, and ultimately a fatal cerebral event. He spent an evening in his greenhouse, carefully harvesting leaves and flowers. The distillation process was familiar, meditative. As the clear, viscous liquid dripped into the vial, he felt the same sense of rightness, of cosmic balance being restored. His delivery method this time would be even more subtle. Thorne was a creature of academic habit. Every Thursday he attended a faculty lecture in the university's old auditorium, always sitting in the same third-row seat, always with a bottle of water. Alastair, using a forged faculty ID, easily entered the campus. He was just another older gentleman in a tweed jacket, blending into the background of intellectual life. He found the lecture hall empty an hour before the presentation. He moved to Thorne's usual seat, unscrewed the cap from the sealed bottle of water the professor always left on the chair to reserve his spot, and added 2 drops of the oleander extract. He resealed the bottle with a special tool he'd designed, leaving no trace. The crime was committed before the victim even arrived. He left a single, pressed pink oleander blossom in his pocket, the bookmark for Dr. Thorne's final chapter. 2 days later, Detective Rossi's phone rang. It was the university police. A professor had collapsed during a lecture, dead on arrival at the hospital, apparent massive stroke. When Rossi arrived at the scene, the auditorium was nearly empty, save for a few campus officers. She walked down to the third row, to the seat where Dr. Thorne had fallen, And there, on the polished wood floor where his head had lain, was a single pressed pink flower. Rossi felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't a loose thread anymore. It was a pattern, a beautiful, terrifying, and repeating pattern. She pulled out her phone and dialed the precinct. "Miller," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "Reopen the Clara Evans file. We have a serial killer." The precinct basement smelled of stale coffee and desperation. It was Detective Rossi's natural habitat. She had commandeered the largest corkboard in the squad room, and it was now her mosaic of obsession. Two faces smiled out from the center. Clara Evans, vibrant and young, Dr. Alistair Thorne, stern and academic. Between them were crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and close-ups of two delicate pressed flowers, one golden, one pink. "Natural causes," Miller said, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Two of them. The medical examiner is standing by it. The captain is standing by it. You're chasing a ghost, Izzy, a very floral ghost." "They're connected," Rossi said, not turning from the board. She tapped a photo of the helichrysum. "This flower, it's a signature, it's a statement. It's not something a person dying of a heart attack or a stroke just drops. It's a coincidence, a weird one, I'll give you that. But what's the motive? What's the connection between a 26-year-old graphic designer and a 68-year-old ethics professor? Nothing. Zilch." Rossi knew he was right. On the surface, there was no link. Different social circles, different parts of the city, different lives. But the pattern was too perfect, too elegant to be random. This killer wasn't chaotic. They were methodical. An artist. And artists, even twisted ones, had a theme. Frustrated, she began making follow-up calls, re-interviewing the families and friends, not about the deaths, but about the lives. She was looking for a loose thread, a forgotten detail. Most of the calls were dead ends, rehashing the same grief and confusion. But then she reached Clara Evans's sister, Sarah. "We've been going through her apartment," Sarah said, her voice thick with sorrow. "It's hard. So many of her things. But there was this one weird thing. A letter from the Grand Athenaeum Library. A final notice, I think. For a book. It seemed so trivial, you know, with everything else going on." Rossi's pen froze over her notepad. "A library book? Do you know which one?" "Something Italian, I think. Fiori di, something. She was a bit of a hoarder. I'm not surprised she lost it. I just feel bad. It's probably going to cost a fortune in fines." Rossi thanked her, her heart hammering against her ribs. A library book. It was a strange, mundane detail in a tragic story, but it was a detail. She hung up the phone and stared at the board. A library. A place of order, of knowledge, of silence. A place where a late book was a transgression. She grabbed her coat. "Miller, with me." "Where are we going?" "To the university. I need to talk to Dr. Thorne's department head." An hour later, they were sitting in the cluttered office of Dr. Aris Thorne's colleague, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses. Alistair was a brilliant mind, if a bit forgetful, he said. Lived in his own world of ideas. I'm not surprised he misplaced a library book. He was terrible with returning things. He had that Kant book from the Athenaeum for years, I think. We all teased him about it. There it was, the second thread. The Grand Athenaeum Library. Rossi felt the pieces click into place with a satisfying, terrifying snap. The killer wasn't targeting people. He was targeting overdue books. The people were just late fees. Meanwhile, in the quiet sanctuary of his office, Alistair Finch read the small article in the city paper. Police were exploring possible connections between the two recent deaths. He allowed himself a small, thin smile. They were like children trying to read a text in a language they didn't understand. They saw the flowers, but they couldn't comprehend the grammar. They were looking for rage, or jealousy, or greed. They would never find it, because his motive was one they couldn't comprehend, order. He turned the page, dismissing the article. The world outside the library's walls was noise and nonsense. His focus was already on the next item on the long-overdue list. The name was Marcus Vance, a 24-year-old software developer. The book, Algorithms and Data Structures. Due date, 218 days ago. Alistair had seen Vance's social media, a smug parade of stock options, expensive cars, and flippant comments about brute-forcing problems. A man who built his life on logic, yet couldn't follow the simple logic of returning a shared resource. The hypocrisy was galling. For him, Alistair was considering something from the Nightshade family, A digital mind deserved an analog correction. Back at the precinct, Rossi slammed a stack of printouts onto her desk. She had spent the last 3 hours pulling public records. Both Evans and Thorne had library cards at the Grand Athenaeum. It was the only verifiable link. She needed to see their borrowing history. She needed the list of the lost. "The captain will never sign off on a warrant for library records," Miller said, peering at the documents. "It's a fishing expedition." "It's not a fishing expedition," Rossi shot back, her eyes blazing. "It's a subscription list, and I think our killer is the publisher." She stormed into the captain's office, laid out her theory, the flowers, the signature, the library connection. He listened, his face a mask of skepticism. But Rossi was relentless, her voice a low, steady drumbeat of logic and conviction. Finally, he held up his hands. "Fine, Rossi. Fine. You want to chase this librarian from hell? Be my guest. But you get one shot, one warrant. Don't come back empty-handed." Rossi didn't even wait for him to finish signing. She snatched the warrant from his desk and was already out the door, her mind racing. She was on her way to the Grand Athenaeum. She was about to walk into the killer's church. The Grand Athenaeum Library did not welcome Detective Rossi. It tolerated her. The moment she stepped through the towering bronze doors, the city's noise was swallowed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. To Alistair, this was peace. To Rossi, it was the watchful quiet of a predator's lair. The soaring vaulted ceiling, with its clerestory windows, felt less like a cathedral of knowledge and more like a tomb. She approached the main circulation desk, a monolith of carved mahogany, and presented her warrant to a young librarian who looked at it as if it were written in a dead language. The librarian scurried away, returning a moment later with a man who moved with an unnerving stillness. "Detective Rossi," he said, his voice a low, placid baritone. "I am Alistair Finch, the head of Special Collections. I understand you require some assistance." Rossi's eyes took him in. He was in his late 50s, perhaps, with neat gray hair, spectacles perched on a thin nose, and the long, delicate fingers of a surgeon or a pianist. He was the very image of an antiquarian bookworm. There was no menace in his posture, no shiftiness in his gaze. He was calm, utterly, completely calm. "I need the borrowing histories for these two individuals," Rossi said, sliding the names across the desk. "Clara Evans and Alistair Thorne." "Of course," Alistair said without a hint of surprise. He seemed to approve of her directness. He turned to a computer terminal, and his fingers flew across the keyboard with a quiet, rhythmic tapping. A moment of tragedy for both. Miss Evans had Fiori di Firenze, a lovely, if fragile, volume. Dr. Thorne had our first edition Kant, a significant loss to the community. He printed out 2 sheets of paper and handed them to her. "Is there anything else?" "Yes," Rossi said, her eyes locked on his. "I need a list of everyone with an overdue book." Alistair offered a small, regretful smile. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Detective. Patron privacy is a cornerstone of our institution. The confidentiality of a borrower's record is sacrosanct. It's a matter of principle." "2 of your patrons are dead, Mr. Finch," Rossi said, her voice dropping. "And I believe the person who killed them is picking his victims from that list. Your principal is about to get someone else killed." Alistair removed his spectacles and polished them with a soft cloth from his pocket. The gesture was slow, deliberate. "A tragic, and I dare say unfounded conjecture. The correlation you're suggesting is fantastical. I cannot, in good conscience, violate the trust of our entire readership based on a detective's hunch." He was a wall of polite, unyielding bureaucracy. But as he spoke, Rossi noticed something. His eyes, when he mentioned the books, held a flicker of something else. Not sadness, but possession, as if the books were his children who had been harmed. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible tell, but it was enough. "Fine," she said, taking the printouts. "But I'll be back, Mr. Finch, with a different kind of warrant." "I shall be here," he said simply. "The library is always here." As Rossi walked away, Alistair watched her go. He felt no fear, only a mild irritation. She was a disruption, a piece of grit in the otherwise perfect machinery of his work. He had underestimated the persistence of the common mind. It saw a pattern and, rather than admiring its elegance, sought to smash it. He knew he had to accelerate his schedule. The system required it. That evening, as Detective Rossi was staring at her corkboard, trying to find a way around the library's privacy wall, Alistair was in his greenhouse. He was tending to his nightshade, the Atropa belladonna. Its berries were a deep, lustrous black, a beautiful temptation hiding a deadly secret. For Marcus Vance, the arrogant software developer, a digital poison was fitting. Alistair had learned that Vance worked late most nights, fueled by a particular brand of artisanal energy drink he bought from a boutique market near his loft. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Alistair would purchase a case of the same drink. Using a syringe with a microscopic needle, he would inject a single, concentrated drop of belladonna extract into each can through the bottom seam. The toxin would be tasteless, the tiny hole unnoticeable. The effect would be a rapid descent into hallucinations, paralysis, and respiratory failure. A tragic, unexplained reaction to a popular beverage. He would leave a single, pressed belladonna flower on the scene, a beautiful, deadly nightshade. Back in the precinct basement, Rossi was hitting a wall. She couldn't get the list, but she could think like the killer. He wasn't just random, he was a judge. What was his next case? She couldn't access the confidential list, but most libraries, in a fit of public shaming, had a most overdue or lost treasures section on their website. She pulled up the Athenaeum site. There it was. A digital wanted poster for lost books. And near the top of the list, with a photo of its slick modern cover, was algorithms and data structures, noted as being 218 days overdue. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. She cross-referenced the title with city records, university bookstores, and tech forums. It was a long shot, a needle in a digital haystack. But then she found it, a post on a coding forum from 6 months ago. A user named M. Vance, complaining about a university library's antiquated policies and how he'd acquired a copy of the algorithm's text he'd checked out and had no intention of returning. Rossi's blood ran cold. She had a name, Marcus Vance. She pulled up his address. He was the one. She was sure of it. She grabbed her jacket and her keys, her heart pounding. The librarian was preparing his next volume, and she was the only one who knew it wasn't a book he planned to check out. The city lights smeared across Detective Rossi's windshield as she drove, the siren silent, but the light bar painting the wet streets in frantic flashes of red and blue. Miller sat beside her, his skepticism finally worn down by the sheer, unshakable conviction in her voice. "A wellness check based on a forum post, is he? The captain will have our badges," he said, but he was already checking his weapon. "Then he can have them," Rossi snapped, taking a sharp turn. "As long as we're not handing them over because we let another kid die." They pulled up to a sleek, glass and steel apartment building that looked like a shard of the future dropped into an old neighborhood. This was Marcus Vance's world. No dust, no history, just clean lines and cold efficiency. It was the antithesis of everything Alistair Finch held dear. Rossi hammered on the door of apartment 7B. "Mr. Vance, police, we need to talk to you." Silence. She hammered again, louder this time. Nothing. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, coiled in her stomach. "Get the manager," she told Miller. While Miller went to rouse the building's super, Rossi pressed her ear to the door. She couldn't hear anything. No music, no computer sounds, no signs of life. She was too late. She knew it. The librarian had already checked out his next volume. A few minutes later, a sleepy, annoyed manager let them in with a pass key. The moment the door swung open, the smell hit them. It wasn't the scent of death, not yet. It was the sickly sweet aroma of energy drinks and something else, something acrid, like burnt plastic. The apartment was a disaster zone of technology. 3 monitors glowed on a desk, lines of code frozen midstream, wires snaked across the floor like vines. Empty takeout containers and cans of the same energy drink, Volt Rush, were piled on every available surface. It was a temple to disposable convenience. And there, on the floor between the desk and a high-end gaming chair, was Marcus Vance. He wasn't dead. His body was twitching, his limbs jerking in a grotesque, arrhythmic dance. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't seeing the room. They were seeing something else, something terrifying. A thin line of drool trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Ambulance, now!" Rossi yelled into her radio, kneeling beside him. His skin was clammy, his pulse a frantic, fluttering thing against her fingers. He was in the throes of a severe neurological event. Belladonna. As Miller relayed the information, Rossi's eyes scanned the room. This was the killer's canvas. And there, on the polished surface of the coffee table, right next to a half-empty can of Volt Rush, was his signature. A single pressed black flower, its petals like dark, dried tears. A belladonna blossom. The bookmark. She had been right. The theory was real. The killer was real. And he had almost claimed another victim. She stood up, a wave of adrenaline and fury washing over her. She walked to the large window that overlooked the street. The paramedics would be there any second. Vance might live. They had interrupted the process. They had won this round. And then she saw him. Down on the sidewalk, across the street, a man was walking away. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was strolling with the unhurried, measured pace of someone taking an evening constitutional. He wore a tweed jacket and carried a reusable shopping bag. He looked completely out of place in the modern, bustling street, yet utterly at ease with himself. He stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change, and glanced up, not at the building, but at the night sky, as if admiring the constellations. In that moment, under the orange glow of the streetlights, Rossi saw his face. It was the placid, composed face of Alistair Finch, the head of special collections, the keeper of the keys, the librarian. He wasn't looking for a reaction. He wasn't gloating. He was simply observing, ensuring his work was proceeding as intended. He was a scientist checking on his experiment. The light changed and he stepped off the curb, turning the corner and disappearing from view. Rossi's breath caught in her throat. She had been feet away, just a few floors above him. He had been there, watching, while they fought to save his victim. The game had changed. It was no longer about catching a ghost. It was about hunting a man she had met, a man whose name she knew. A man who was, at that very moment, probably walking back to his quiet, ordered life, already planning his next trip to the stacks. The ambulance screamed away from the curb, a frantic, wailing cry against the city's hum. Marcus Vance was alive, but just barely, his body fighting a war against a poison it was never meant to understand. Detective Rossi stood in the wreckage of his apartment, the scent of burnt sugar and death clinging to her clothes. "He was there," she said, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos around her. "Finch, I saw him across the street. He was watching." Miller stared at her, his face pale under the fluorescent lights of the kitchen. "The librarian? You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Rossi said, pulling out her phone. "He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just observing, like a scientist checking his petri dish." She dialed the captain. "We have him. We have a name. Alistair Finch. I need a warrant for his home, his office, everything, and I need it now." The captain, hearing the iron certainty in her voice, didn't argue. The machinery of law enforcement, once a sluggish beast, roared to life. While the city mobilized, Alistair Finch was returning to his sanctuary. The failure of the Vance correction was an irritant, a smudge on an otherwise perfect record. He had not anticipated a police intervention. It was an illogical variable. He had observed the ambulance arrive with a detached sense of curiosity. The experiment had been contaminated. He let himself into his quiet bungalow, the neatness of his home a balm to his frayed sense of order. He did not go to his greenhouse. Not yet. First, he had to process the disruption. He sat in his armchair, the same one he'd sat in after Clara Evans's death, but the feeling of satisfaction was absent, replaced by a cold, analytical need to understand the flaw. The flaw was Detective Rossi. She was not like the others. She didn't see the surface. She saw the structure. She was a reader who understood the subtext. He opened the file on Marcus Vance and, with a red pen, wrote neatly across the front, "Incomplete." Then he pulled out the long-overdue list. His eyes scanned the names, the due dates. The work was too important to be derailed by a single persistent detective. The system required balance. He would simply have to be more careful. An hour later, the silence of the Grand Athenaeum was shattered. The heavy bronze doors swung open to admit Detective Rossi, Detective Miller, and 2 uniformed officers. The night librarian on duty looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "We have a warrant for Alistair Finch and his office," Rossi said, her voice echoing in the vast, silent space. They found him exactly where she expected him, in his office, behind the botanical texts of the 19th century shelf. He wasn't surprised. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, a single lamp casting a warm, focused circle of light on the open book before him. He looked up as they entered, his expression one of mild, academic curiosity. "Detective Rossi," he said, his voice as calm and measured as ever. He gently closed the book, his fingers tracing the gilt-edged pages. "An unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the intrusion?" "Alistair Finch, you're under arrest for the murders of Clara Evans and Alistair Thorne and the attempted murder of Marcus Vance," Miller said, stepping forward with handcuffs. Alistair held up a single, long finger, a gesture of quiet authority that made Miller pause. "Murder is such a crude term, Detective, as is attempted. I prefer to think of my work as curatorial, a necessary weeding of the garden to allow the more deserving specimens to thrive." Rossi stepped around Miller, her eyes locked on his. "You poisoned them, Finch. You poisoned them because they were late returning library books." Alistair's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Precisely. A broken covenant is a cancer. If left untreated, it spreads. Disrespect for knowledge begets ignorance. I am simply the surgeon. The book you see on my desk," he gestured to the closed volume, "is Herbarium Venenorum, a 17th century text on poisonous plants. A fascinating study. Did you know that the ancient Greeks believed the fates themselves used the roots of the aconitum plant to determine the length of a mortal's life? I am merely assisting the fates." He was confessing, but not in a way they could use. He was speaking in metaphors, in riddles. He was enjoying this final intellectual sparring match in his own arena. "We have your greenhouse, Finch," Rossi said, watching his face for any flicker of emotion. "We have your poisons. We have the flowers you left behind." "Ah, the bookmarks," he said, a genuine note of pleasure in his voice. A final, respectful tribute, a promise that even in death, a part of them returns to the earth, to the library of life. It's all connected, you see. As Miller moved in again with the cuffs, Alistair opened a drawer in his desk. He didn't reach for a weapon. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and a single pressed flower. It was a white lily, its petals as fragile as porcelain. "I was preparing for my next procedure," he said, sliding the journal across the desk. It was open to a page with a name and address. A Mrs. Eleanor Gable, age 82. She has had a copy of Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management since 2009. A classic, of course, but one she has clearly failed to appreciate. The lily is for her, symbolizes purity, the restoration of a clean slate. He looked directly at Rossi, his gray eyes clear and utterly sane. "You have stopped me, Detective. For now. But the list is long. The disrespect is endemic. You have arrested one man, but you have not cured the disease. The books are still out there, waiting. Who will balance the scales now?" He held out his hands, wrists together, a picture of serene surrender. But his words hung in the air, a chilling final lecture. He had been caught, but in his mind he had not been defeated. He had simply passed his unfinished work on to her. The interrogation room was a box of beige and gray, designed for discomfort. A metal table, 3 chairs, and a two-way mirror that reflected a distorted, funhouse version of the room's occupants. For Alistair Finch, it was an aesthetic offense. For Detective Rossi, it was a tool. She sat opposite him, a file folder on the table between them. Miller stood by the door, a silent, imposing presence. Finch, however, seemed perfectly at ease. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees, as if he were waiting for a lecture to begin. "The lab results came back from your greenhouse, Alistair," Rossi began, her voice even. She didn't open the file. "The delphinium, the oleander, the belladonna, all perfectly cultivated, all perfectly matched to the toxins found in your victims, your curatorial work." "A gardener is judged by the quality of his specimens," Finch replied, his tone placid. "I am pleased to know my work met a professional standard." "Your tools, too," Rossi continued, tapping the folder. "The custom alembic, the syringes with microscopic needles, the device you used to reseal the water bottle, all exquisitely made. You're a craftsman, I'll give you that." "Precision is the soul of intellect, Detective. To do a thing properly, one must have the proper instruments." "You left a journal," Rossi said, finally opening the folder. She slid a photograph of the open page with Eleanor Gable's name across the table. "You were going to kill an 82-year-old woman over a cookbook." "A cookbook that has shaped domestic life in the Western world for over a century," Finch corrected, a hint of pedantry in his voice. "Mrs. Gable had a decade to appreciate its wisdom. She chose not to. Her disregard was a symptom of a societal decay, a decay that, if left unchecked, leads to the collapse of civilization itself. It begins with a single unreturned book, Detective. It ends with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Rossi leaned forward, her coffee-colored eyes boring into his. Let me tell you what it really begins with. It begins with a phone call. A sister, sobbing because the person she loved most in the world is gone. It begins with a university department, shattered, trying to understand how a colleague just vanished. It begins with a young man, Marcus Vance, who might live, but who will have nightmares for the rest of his life because he drank a can of energy drink. That's the chaos you created, Alistair. Not order, chaos. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Finch's face. It wasn't remorse. It was a profound, almost sorrowful disappointment. You see the trees, but you miss the forest. You see the individual grief, which is, of course, regrettable. But you fail to see the greater good, the preservation of the whole. Sometimes a branch must be pruned for the health of the tree. I am the pruner. You're not a pruner, Rossi said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You're a vandal. You took lives, complex, messy, beautiful lives, and you reduced them to a line on a list, a due date. You talk about the sanctity of knowledge, but you disrespected the most sacred knowledge of all, the value of a human life. She stood up, pushing her chair back. We have you, Alistair. The poisons, the tools, the journal, the flowers. You'll never see the inside of that library again. You'll never see your greenhouse. Your work is over. Finch looked up at her, and in his gray eyes, Rossi saw not a defeated man, but a keeper of a faith who was being martyred for his beliefs. My work is never over, Detective, he said softly. The list is endless. The books are still out there. You have locked away the librarian, but you have done nothing about the overdue books. You have not restored order. You have only delayed the inevitable. He fell silent then, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were already back in his library, walking the silent aisles in his mind. He had built a fortress of logic around his soul, and Rossi's words, though true, could not penetrate its walls. She had caught the monster, but she could not kill the idea that drove him. As she walked out of the room, his final words echoed in her mind. She had won the battle, but she was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that the war he declared on the world's carelessness was a war that could never truly be won. The trial of Alistair Finch was a quiet, methodical affair, much like the man himself. The media dubbed him the Librarian and the Bloom Killer, but their sensational headlines felt cheap against the cold, articulate philosophy he presented from the witness stand. He never denied his actions, he reframed them. He spoke of duty, of order, of the sacred covenant between knowledge and humanity. The jury, faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence and the chillingly calm confession of a man who saw murder as a public service, took less than 2 hours to convict him. Life at the 12th Precinct returned to its usual rhythm of stabbings and domestic disputes, but the case left a scar on Detective Rossi. It was a wound of the intellect, a phantom itch. She found herself looking for patterns in the mundane, for the hidden systems beneath the chaos of the city. She saw Finch's ghost everywhere, in the neatly stacked cans at the grocery store, in the alphabetical arrangement of files at the dentist. He had infected her with his need for order. A month after the trial, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Rossi found herself standing before the bronze doors of the Grand Athenaeum Library. She wasn't there on official business. She was there to return a book. A copy of Herbarium Venenorum she'd checked out from the City Law Library, wanting to understand the world that had shaped Alistair Finch. It was due yesterday. The silence inside was the same, but it felt different now. It was no longer the watchful quiet of a predator's lair, but the gentle hum of a living, breathing space. She saw students hunched over laptops, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a mother quietly shushing her toddler as he pointed at a colorful picture book. This was the chaos Finch had sought to prune, the messy, imperfect, vibrant humanity of it all. She walked to the circulation desk, the book heavy in her hands. As she waited in line, her eyes fell on a corkboard on the wall. Tacked to it was a sheet of paper titled, Our Most Wanted, a Plea for Their Return. It was the public list of the most overdue books, names, titles, and due dates laid out for all to see. For a moment, Finch's voice was a cold whisper in her ear. The list is endless. The books are still out there. She read the names. Moby Dick, checked out in 2011. To Kill a Mockingbird, 2015. A worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude, due in the spring of 2018. She saw the names not as a roster of sinners, but as a collection of stories. Each book represented a moment in someone's life, a time when they were curious, or in love, or in school before life got in the way, before they forgot. When it was her turn, she placed her own overdue book on the counter. The young librarian scanned it, and the computer chimed softly. "There will be a small fine, detective," the librarian said. 25 cents. Rossi smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I know," she said, pulling a quarter from her pocket and placing it on the counter. She looked past the librarian at the rows and rows of books stretching into the distance. They were not prisoners waiting to be rescued. They were stories waiting to be rediscovered. She turned and walked away, leaving the fine on the counter. She didn't need a receipt. She had not come to balance a ledger. She had come to participate, to be a small, imperfect part of the beautiful, chaotic, and endlessly forgiving library of the world. The scales were balanced, not by a cold and perfect justice, but by a simple, human act of returning a book. And that was a story worth telling.